India proves China is a paper tiger. Chinese troops crushed in their first real combat disaster. China has been closely watching the war between India and Pakistan. Why? Because China has been rapidly expanding its military, with its defense budget increasing every year. They're buying huge amounts of weapons and training millions of soldiers. Their ultimate goal is to someday surpass the United States. That's why the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, is paying close attention to the conflict between India and Pakistan. It's one of the first times Chinese-made military equipment is being used in an actual war. However, some people call China a paper tiger, especially when it comes to its military. Even though the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, might be good at defending the CCP within China, it's not prepared for war outside its borders. The main reason? The PLA lacks real combat experience. The last war they fought was the invasion of Vietnam in 1979, and it went terribly. Since then, their involvement has mostly been limited to UN peacekeeping missions. One of those missions even ended in disaster, with 2 Chinese soldiers killed. To understand why China struggles with projecting global power, let's look at that incident. This event exposed how poorly the Chinese military performs in real combat. Naturally, the CCP's online bots won't like this video and will probably try to attack it in every way to reduce its reach. So if you want to help us fight those bots, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. It really helps. Thank you. Back in 2015, China decided to send troops to support UN peacekeeping operations, years after first joining the UN Peacekeeping Observer Group in 1990. They deployed 700 Chinese soldiers and officers, forming China's first-ever infantry battalion under the UN. This unit was sent to Juba, the capital of the newly formed country of South Sudan, which only gained independence from Sudan in 2011. But just 2 years after becoming independent, in 2013, South Sudan fell into a brutal civil war. President Salva Kiir accused his Vice President Riek Machar of trying to stage a coup. This triggered a multi-sided conflict filled with ethnic violence. The war didn't end until 2020, leaving around 400,000 people dead and forcing 1.5 million to flee the country, with another 2 million displaced internally. By August 2015, there was a bit of hope. Both sides agreed to a ceasefire, which was supposed to be enforced by UN peacekeeping forces in South Sudan. The Chinese peacekeepers stationed in Juba were meant to protect local civilians and provide aid. Juba had over 300,000 residents at the time. China wasn't alone. India, Ethiopia, Rwanda and many other countries also contributed troops. In total, there were about 12,500 UN soldiers from 61 countries in South Sudan, with a few thousand stationed in the capital alone. The Chinese troops were based on the western edge of Juba, near a UN compound and 2 refugee camps called Protection of Civilians, Sites 1 and 3. There was also another UN base northeast of the city, near Juba's airport, where troops from other countries were stationed. That location was a key logistics hub and had a level 2 hospital with surgical equipment. It was also closer to downtown, where most embassies were located. But the peacekeeping operation in Juba was doomed from the start. Even though UN troops were in the city, both sides in the conflict grew increasingly nervous. In violation of the ceasefire, soldiers from both the government and rebel forces began building bases in and around the city. Rebel forces alone sent 1,400 fighters into Juba, right next to government positions. In total, 10 military camps were set up inside or near the city. Things were bound to go wrong, and they did. On July 3rd, a lieutenant loyal to the vice president was killed. 4 days later, on July 7th, a clash resulted in 5 soldiers loyal to the president being killed. From there, things spiraled quickly. On July 8th, in an effort to stop the violence, Kiir and Machar agreed to meet at the presidential palace. But during the press conference, a firefight broke out between Makar's bodyguards and Kiir's presidential guards. This sparked all-out fighting across the city. Eventually, government forces took control of most of Juba. UN peacekeepers mostly stayed neutral, and their compounds were left untouched, at first. But on July 10th, President Kiir reportedly ordered the assassination of Makar. Government troops backed by tanks swept through the city. As the mission collapsed, South Sudanese troops looted refugee camps, stealing $30 million worth of UN supplies, including enough food to feed 200,000 people for a month. They also committed horrific acts against refugees that we can't even describe here. Still, not everything was a failure. The Chinese troops did manage to shelter 9,000 civilians inside the compound. But with over 300 civilian deaths, 20 of them inside the camp, and aid workers being attacked just outside, China's peacekeeping performance was heavily criticized. One such critic was the Center for Civilians in Conflict, which blamed Chinese peacekeepers for not doing their job and said much of the violence could have been prevented. Allegedly, the UN ordered peacekeepers to expand their perimeter and break up the fighting. But the Chinese and others never left their bases. Instead, they gave up ground and only returned fire a few times. Even former UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon was unhappy. He called for an independent investigation, and the resulting UN report blamed chaotic leadership for failing to protect civilians. The report said that calls to form a rapid response unit were ignored by all UN contingents. Despite having 1,800 troops on paper, they were barely used. And honestly, it's understandable why the peacekeepers didn't want to leave their bases. They had a few white armoured vehicles and light arms, not enough to go up against tanks, mortars and jets. Plus, they weren't allowed to use force unless in self-defence or to protect civilians as a last resort. And separating two active armies? Almost impossible. Another big issue: the UN forces weren't under unified command. Orders conflicted between the Chinese, Ethiopian, Nepalese and Indian troops. The Chinese refused to take orders from foreign commanders. They weren't trained for that. Worse, many Chinese soldiers didn't even understand the rules of engagement. They constantly asked who they were allowed to shoot. So if peacekeepers can't act when things get serious, what's the point? Their job was to protect civilians, but with hundreds dead in Juba, they clearly failed. China, of course, denies everything. A spokesman for China's Ministry of Defense called the UN report malicious speculation. He claimed the Chinese peacekeepers held their positions, quickly called for reinforcements, carried out their mission and rescued the wounded. But the UN's independent investigation told a different story. China argues it was never responsible for protecting people outside the compound, and that breaking up the fighting was unrealistic. In the end, there were no major consequences, though China did demand South Sudan punish those responsible for the deaths of their peacekeepers. Meanwhile, China's peacekeeping efforts continued, but the original troops were replaced. Many were too traumatized to continue. On patrol, they refused to get out of their armored vehicles, only peeking out through the windows. Since then, China has sent a new peacekeeping battalion every year. In December 2024, the 11th Chinese peacekeeping battalion was welcomed in Juba. According to the UN, they're now combat-ready. Maybe they've learned from past mistakes. After all, President Xi Jinping ordered a massive military overhaul in 2017, 1 year after the Juba disaster. And overall, the mission wasn't a total failure for China. It gave them a chance to learn and evolve. That's why they've continued joining new UN peacekeeping missions even after Juba. Since 2015, China has sent over 50,000 troops on 24 UN peacekeeping missions, making it the 9th largest contributor to the UN's Blue Helmets. 16 Chinese peacekeepers have died in these missions, sacrificing their lives for others. China also provides huge financial support. It's now the second largest funder of UN peacekeeping operations, behind only the US. That's important because it helps keep fragile parts of the world stable. But many believe China has its own motives, like expanding influence abroad. South Sudan is a clear example. The country holds about 4 billion barrels of confirmed oil reserves. China owns 41% of Dar Petroleum, a major company producing 90,000 barrels a day, crucial to Chinese energy security. That's partly why China sent peacekeepers to protect its oil interests. There are also 3 trillion cubic feet of untapped gas in Sudan and South Sudan combined, plus other valuable resources like iron ore, copper, gold and rare earth metals. And since the country is still underdeveloped, there are plenty of infrastructure opportunities. China recently completed a major infrastructure project in South Sudan, the Clementon Bridge. But they're also gaining influence through shady deals. China is one of the biggest arms suppliers to both sides of South Sudan's conflict. So, no matter who wins, they rely on China. And yet it's ironic. Selling weapons and doing peacekeeping at the same time? It just shows China's bigger ambitions in South Sudan, gaining influence and real combat experience. The UN knows countries act in their own self-interest, but so far China's involvement has been a net positive. Still, peacekeeping may not be the right way for China to solve its biggest problem, lack of combat experience. Sure, it teaches them how to run bases and respond to threats, but UN peacekeeping is always limited in scope. And Juba wasn't the first time peacekeeping failed. It's happened before, like the 1995 Srebrenica massacre during the Bosnian War. Over 8,000 Bosniaks were killed by Bosnian Serbs, while a lightly armed Dutch UN battalion stood by, unable to stop it. Or Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 people were killed in just 100 days. The UN had less than 3,000 troops in the whole country, woefully unprepared. The UN keeps trying to improve peacekeeping, but at its core, the system still has major flaws. Thanks for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is S News. We're committed to bringing you honest, traditional reporting. See you in the next